Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Chuck, and thanks to Shuki Cohen, who invited me, who was not able to be here. When he invited me, I actually wrote him an email and I said, "Sure, you want me to come? I have a somewhat critical perspective on the war on terror." And he said, "Absolutely. We want to encourage our students to hear from people who have a diverse range of opinions and perspectives." So that's how I wound up coming here. But by extension, you're not my usual audience, although I don't know what an usual audience is anymore. This is a new book that I'm embarking on. I'm very eager to hear your thoughts, your feedback, and your commentary on this. I'm drawing from the Islamophobia book, but what I will be speaking about today, the bulk of it is actually new. It's stuff that is going to go into the next book I'm working on, which is the cultural politics of the war on terror and the national security state. So let's see how it goes, and let's have a good discussion after I get done. So I want to begin by explaining the title as a way to talk about the approach that I take to this topic. And you'll see the word manufacturing in the title. And that word has been used to make the point that how we view terrorism, how we view the terrorist threat, is actually socially constructed. Now, this is not to say that there is no danger from political violence, or what people refer to as terrorism, however one defines it. It's not to say that that threat does not exist, but how we view this threat, how big we think it is, and what we think we should do about it, and how much of a society's resources should be spent on it, these are socially constructed, I'm going to argue. Furthermore, we didn't suddenly wake up someday and decide that we have a pathological fear of brown men, particularly Arab and Muslim men. That too is very much socially constructed. And so I'll quickly go through the approach that I'm taking. The approach is called social constructionism, and essentially give you an introduction to what the social constructionist approach is. In a nutshell, it seeks to uncover the ways in which individuals and groups participate in the construction of a perceived social reality. So it involves looking at social phenomena such as terrorism and examining how they are created, institutionalized, known, and then made into tradition by human beings. And the social construction of reality, as it's called, this is the title of a book by Berger and Luckman that was published in the 1960s. The social construction is seen as an ongoing and dynamic process, one that can't be produced at one point and ended. It must keep being produced and reproduced in order to persist. And when you say that reality is constantly produced and reproduced, what you do is you say that there is an opportunity for change, that shifts can occur, and what started with one dynamic actually can emerge into another kind. And of course, there are power dynamics involved here. Not everyone is an equal player in the social construction of reality. Some groups, because of the political or economic power that they have, will play a key role in shaping a particular phenomenon. And so part of what I'm going to do is talk about how the political elites from the 1970s to the present have played this kind of role, but also how Hollywood and the media have reinforced and or contributed vocabulary to this understanding of the terrorist threat. And finally, I'm going to talk about resistance to this dominant narrative. Now, those of you who have studied the scholarship on media and terrorism research, I'm not going to be looking at that scholarship. You may have come across the culpable media model, which basically says that there's a causal link between terrorism and the media, and that the media sort of foster and encourage terrorism and so forth. There's another one that says that's the vulnerable media model, which sees the media as victims, not the causes of terrorism and so forth. And there are some merits to this model, but I actually find them somewhat limited. Instead, what I would like to do is bring what C. Wright Mills, the sociologist, refers to as the sociological imagination to this question. What does that mean, the sociological imagination? Well, it's the ability to see society in its complexity and analyzed how various parts of society, how various institutions and actors and so on interact and influence each other. And to have a sociological imagination in part, you've got to be like an extraterrestrial. You've got to step out of the context that you're in and be willing to see things from an alternative viewpoint. And the way that C. Wright Mills puts it is he says, to acquire a sociological imagination requires us to think ourselves away from our daily routines and look at them anew, right? And routines, I'm going to argue in this lecture, are very important. They normalize a certain point of view, and I'm going to ask you to step out of that routinization and think more critically. Right, so I want to begin with a video that actually represents the culmination of 4 decades of cultural and political work that have gone into constructing the terrorist enemy.
بس كيف رح ياخذ الشهادة إذا كمشوني؟
هذا هدفنا. بعد ما تقتل الكفار كلهم سلم نفسك. ساعتها بنعوز الله القوانين تبعهم، المحاميين تبعهم، الأخبار، التلفزيون، كله نوصل رسالتنا للعالم كله. ساعتها هذا طريقنا الوحيد للسمع.
My name's Dan Finelli. Send me to Washington, and I'll send our enemies where they belong, and that's not to a courtroom.
Yes, it is amusing, isn't it? The good news is that Dan Finelli lost the elections. But the bad news is that he was able to actually run an ad like this and it didn't create any sort of massive controversy, right? And that's why I start with this to say that there has been 4 decades of work that has gone to producing this image of the terrorist threat. Now, of course, this is a very simplistic representation of the terrorist threat, right? There is no nuance to it. And in case you're confused, that the brown man is the terrorist, he pulls out the white older gentleman and he says, does this look like a terrorist? And you're supposed to say, no, of course not. White people, Timothy McVeigh, the guy in Oslo, none of them actually exist in this world. It's only the brown people and so forth. So it's a very sort of pedantic, simplistic representation of the terrorist threat. But for the most part, you actually don't see this kind of simplicity, particularly not right now, not in the last 4 to 5 years. And this is why the Norman Lear Center, I don't know if you're familiar with the study, but they did a study of 49 different primetime shows the same year that this ad was run, 2010. So they looked at shows like 24, CSI, The Good Wife, Law and Order, and so on. And what they found is that the majority of terrorism suspects, 67%, are actually white American citizens. And that's because there's actually been a shift, and I'm going to go into this shift where the idea of a post-racial society is one that we've seen being promoted in this era. President Obama's own rhetorical posture and so on, as well as the idea of multiculturalism. All of these things come together to create a different terrorist threat narrative. So, in a nutshell, what am I going to do in the time I have today? I'm going to start in the 1970s, when terrorism first starts to be seen as a problem in the United States. Then I'm going to discuss how the terrorist enemy gets racialized in the 1980s and 1990s. Not just in the political sphere, but also in the news and cultural spheres. And finally, I will discuss the normalization, the routinization, if you will, of the terrorist threat in the 2000s and the emergence of the national security state in its current form. So let's begin. So prior to the 1970s, there was really no terrorist threat as such on the American landscape. This was the Cold War. The key enemy was the Soviet Union. And there were 79 hijackings worldwide between 1930 and 1967. 85 US planes were hijacked, Cuba. And the people who were responsible, the perpetrators of these hijackings, weren't called terrorists, at least not uniformly. Instead, they were called bandits, rebels, guerrillas, later urban guerrillas, revolutionaries, insurgents, and so forth. In fact, Remy Brulin, who is actually here, did an analysis of presidential speeches prior to this moment in the 1970s, and in fact, no American president had used the term terrorism or terrorist to refer to hijackings or bombings of commercial aircraft. Instead, they used terms like air pirates, sky pirates, hijackers, and so forth. But by the end of the 1970s, all of these acts that used to be called something else, the bombings, the hijackings, the kidnappings, the hostage takings, and so on, get melded together to now create this menacing, threatening actor known as the terrorist, right? And so the question is, how did this happen? In one decade, how did this actually come to be? The pivotal moment is 1972, the Summer Olympics in Munich, where 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team were taken hostage and eventually killed, along with a German police officer, by the Palestinian group Black September. And this was broadcast, by the global media. They had come not to capture this event, obviously. They had come to cover the Olympic Games, and it was, broadcast to 900 million viewers worldwide. And if you look at the terms that were used to describe the people who actually carried out this incident, they were referred to sometimes as terrorists, but also as criminals, as madmen, as murderers, and so forth. The next line there I have is Richard Nixon. He says these are outlaws who would stop at nothing to accomplish their goals. So in a nutshell, if you look at how this incident and this act was talked about, there was no systematic sort of branding of them, if you will, as terrorists. In fact, in the United States, there was no systematic discourse on terrorism prior to the 1970s, and the New York Times didn't have terrorism as a significant category in its index before 1972, which means that there weren't enough stories that can be categorized as terrorism, and therefore this category did not exist. But as Remy notes, there was actually a developed language of terrorism in France, the United Kingdom, Israel, and South Africa, and elsewhere, and this is because they were facing anti-colonial national liberation struggle movements in these countries, and so they became branded as terrorists in that context. That is, the people who were engaged in these struggles for national liberation. And it is these countries, and I'm going to argue Israel in particular, that would actually shape the discourse around terrorism. So, what follows from 1972, the Munich incident, was a General Assembly meeting at which a particular resolution was voted on, 3034, and Brulin's analysis shows that the debate around this question had no global consensus. There was no sense in which people agreed as to what terrorism actually was, and Remy can talk more if you have questions for him later about his analysis. But it came down in this way, that is, the non-aligned countries, which is the newly independent nations, argued that the use of force in pursuing national liberation was justified, and the West argued against it. But again, there was no uniformity in terms of the West's perspective. The US actually took a very narrow approach in terms of what it considered terrorist, while the Israeli delegate took an extremely broad approach, stating that terrorism was much bigger than what actually happened in Munich. And in fact, he went on to put on the table the idea that the entire international community should be concerned about this event, and furthermore, that Arab governments were actually responsible for acts of this sort. A quote from him: "The Arab terrorist organizations could not continue to operate without the political, financial, and military assistance accorded to them by the Arab governments." And he called upon world governments to fight back against these acts of barbarity, as he put it, with the same determination and tenacity that inspired the Allied nations in their war to eradicate the Nazi plague. So sort of equating this to the Nazis. Right. Now, this argument actually would get taken up and be put on the table in a much more influential way by Benjamin Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, the current head of state of Israel, at that point was the head of an institute known as the Jonathan Institute. And they held two very important conferences in 1979 and 1984, which would come to set the terms of discussion around the question of terrorism. But suffice it to say that by the time we come into the 1980s, this is now the Reagan era, there is a developed language in the United States around terrorism. And Lisa Stampnitsky, whose book you may have come across, it's called Disciplining Terror, she puts it this way. She says, quote, counterterrorism policy under Reagan shifted away from the focus of the 1970s on diplomacy and crisis management and towards military retaliation, accompanied by a new narrative that reframed terrorism as a civilizational struggle between the democracies or the West against a network of terrorists backed by the Soviet Union, right? So military retaliation, aggressive posturing, and a sense in which there is a civilizational struggle that is at work. The West and democracies were against the rest, if you will. So at this point, the 1980s, we now have a well-developed terrorist enemy, and this enemy has also acquired certain racial characteristics, and I'm going to explain how this happened. This is by no means an exhaustive list of what shapes the language from the 1970s to the 1980s. I just happen to have picked them because I think they are significant, and I look forward to hearing from you whether this list should be expanded. But essentially, the defeat in Vietnam and the perceived failure of counterinsurgency shifts the discussion within the military and the political spheres, right? So now there is a new way in which people try to understand what went wrong in Vietnam and why counterinsurgency, which is what informed much of the work in Vietnam, why that is flawed. Now, I'm sure you know the difference between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. There are lots of differences. Fundamentally, counterinsurgency looks at the social and political causes as to why insurgents do what they do. They also see insurgents as rational actors fighting for legitimate goals, whereas counterterrorism actually looks at terrorists as evil, pathological, irrational, fundamentally different from us, and so forth. Certainly the research in the 1980s starts to take that approach. And it's for this reason that the idea of clash of civilizations, which I will come to shortly, sits very well with the kind of counterterrorism framework that you would see come into being in the 1980s. The second shift, if you will, is the shift in the dominant producers of knowledge. Again, I'll refer to Stampnitsky's book here, and she talks about how in the 1970s all sorts of people were involved in producing knowledge about terrorism. Academics, university centers, entrepreneurs, sometimes security firms, the government, and so on and so forth. But as we get into the 1980s, it was the private sector that gets elevated as the key producers of knowledge, at least implementable knowledge, in the 1980s under Reagan, and academics in the university get somewhat sidelined at this point. And what that does is it creates a space for more ideologically driven work, right, in the 1980s. Now the third factor, which causes the shift, I've argued in the book that's on the table there, and that I intend to expand on more in the next book, is the role of conservatives actually in shaping the argument around terrorism, and in particular the neocon-Likud alliance. The neocons are a section of the conservative viewpoint, if you will, and the Likud faction in Israel, the Likud party came into being in the early 1970s. Suffice it to say that they are conservatives of a particular kind. And what I argue is that this alliance between the neocon-Likud alliance actually shapes foreign policy and sets the terms of discussion around terrorism. Now, why is this the case? Does this just happen all of a sudden out of the blue? Well, no, because by the time we come into the late 70s and the 80s, the progressive movements of the 1960s and 70s have pretty much, been destroyed. They've gone to the side. This is the era of the ascendance of conservatism globally, actually, but certainly in the United States as well. And in the US, we see a backlash, the rise of the religious right, the new right as they're called, who would give the election victory to Ronald Reagan, right? And part of what they do when they do that is they bring a particular kind of politics into the mainstream that then gets legitimated. Same thing is going on in Israel. The parties of the religious right, the Haredim, are on the rise in the mid-1970s, and this would pave the way for the Likud victory in the 1977 elections. And both of these religious formations would marshal some of the most virulent forms of racism that would then get reflected in more respectable forms by the Likud Party and by the Republicans in the United States. So the two conferences at which the language is developed, I want to now turn to those two conferences and speak a little bit about them. Jonathan Institute, as I said earlier, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. The first conference happens in 1979, the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, organized by the Jonathan Institute, and it spanned 4 days and drew dozens of high-level officials from 9 countries, including several US senators, a future vice president and president, George Bush Sr., not Jr., and future members of the Reagan administration. And part of these, the people who were in attendance, who would also be somewhat influential under the Reagan administration, are the neoconservatives, people like Richard Pipes, Podhoretz, Wattenberg, the neocon idol Scoop Jackson, even Claire Sterling is also somebody who's present at this. Do people know who Claire Sterling is? She wrote a very popular book in the 1980s about terrorism. She too was in attendance at this conference. And this conference was explicitly designed to serve as an intervention to change the international discourse around terrorism. And there were, in particular, 2 narratives that were introduced to the dignitaries who were at this conference and who would be then instrumental in disseminating these 2 narratives. And the 2 narratives are as follows. First, that the Soviet Union was in fact the key sponsor of terrorism. Okay, that was one line of argumentation, and that's what Claire Sterling popularizes. And second, that terrorism is not a tactic. Terrorism is an attack on civilizations as such, right? There's an us versus them kind of vocabulary, and this notion of a clash of civilization that gets put forward at this conference. And by the way, this conference got extensive media coverage. The Jonathan Institute did a bulletin in which they did a side-by-side comparison to a PBS show, PBS, right? We're not talking about right-wing media. They compared it to a PBS show, and they demonstrated that the arguments from the conference were exactly the ones that were reflected in the show. And furthermore, the organizers would argue that the major themes of the conference were reflected in newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and so on in many parts of the world. So that's 1979, right? The first instance where some of the key, what in media studies we call the primary definers of news, influential political figures, were brought to this event and given language, particularly these 2 narratives, which they would then propagate in various sorts of ways. And they did get a lot of media coverage. But if 1979 got decent media coverage, 1984, which was held in Washington, D.C., received far more media coverage. And if this idea of terrorism as a civilizational attack was just starting to get talked about in 79, it becomes much more developed by the time we come to 1984. In fact, Bernard Lewis, you may know him, Princeton University professor, Orientalist. He's the one who coined the term clash of civilization, and he was a conference speaker at the Washington, D.C. 1984 conference, along with other Orientalists like Elie Kaddouri and so on. And it is this language, the clash of civilizations, that would be responsible for racializing the terrorist enemy, that is, for giving a race identity. to the terrorist enemy. Let me explain finally. I've been using this term clash of civilizations. What does it mean? Now, clash of civilizations is a modern rearticulation of Orientalism. What is Orientalism? And Edward Said talks about how in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, in the context of colonialism, various centers for the study of the Orient would be set up, which produce a body of knowledge, not all of which is, crap and ideological and so on and so forth. Much of it is worthwhile. But the fundamental purpose of this body of knowledge of Orientalism is to pave the way for colonialism. Right? And the clash of civilizations theory is really a reinterpretation of Orientalism for the present day, because back then Orientalism was based on the notion that white people were racially superior to the people who lived in the Middle East or in South Asia and so on, and therefore it was the white man's burden to go off and civilize and colonize and so on and so forth. Now obviously you can't quite use that language today, particularly not after the national liberation struggles of the 1950s and 60s, so it gets repackaged in a much more acceptable form. And if Bernard Lewis is the person who coined the term, it was a political scientist by the name of Samuel Huntington who would then popularize this term. He writes an essay titled Clash of Civilizations ? And then that becomes a book with the question mark completely gone. What does he say? What is the argument? Well, he says that the world is divided into about 7 or 8 civilizations, and each of these civilizations have their own unique cultures, and these cultures are so different from those of the other cultures that people are bound to clash. That is to say, in the post-Soviet era, for Huntington, the key form of conflict was going to be this kind of civilizational and cultural conflict. And so I've pulled a quote from Huntington where he says, in terms of defining Western culture versus the culture, let us say, of quote-unquote Islamic societies, what are some qualities that we might associate with the West? And here's how he puts it. He says, quote, Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, democracy, free markets, the separation of church and state, apple pie, granny, that's my addition, but you know what I mean, all things good and wonderful and so on are qualities associated with the West. And he goes on to say that this often has little resonance in Islamic society, end quote. And so the flip side of this argument is therefore that Eastern societies, Middle East societies are static, barbaric, misogynist, and so on and so forth. Okay. So now I have a few images from the 1970s that illustrate how the clash of civilizations, how this rearticulated Orientalism gets visualized. This is from 1979, and the Time magazine article is about the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But take a look at it for a quick second. If any of you has actually been to Tehran, it looks nothing like that, by the way. Instead, what we have here is a representation of Iran as a country that is static, that is somewhere in the Middle Ages, right? There are no modern buildings of any sort. And that the Iranian Revolution can be explained as this cultural urge to go back and live in the ways of Islam, thereby completely removing from the narrative the fact that people overthrew the Shah, the Western US-backed modernizing Shah, that the grievances that people had were not to do with, some of the reforms that he introduced, like the White Revolution, which actually eviscerated a large number of workers, so they went on strike. It has nothing to do with students, radicals, intellectuals, resisting the way in which the Shah suppressed dissent. Savak, the secret police trained by the CIA and Mossad, basically tortured people who had different viewpoints, and the Shah actually got rid of all political parties except his own. So in other words, there were all sorts of grievances that gave rise to the toppling of the Shah in 1979. But in this framework, all we see is the clash of civilizations. Somehow people are driven by this idea of going back to the Middle Ages and living in these sorts of ways. Now, the hostage crisis of 1979, it goes on for 444 days. That is front page headline news in this country. Most of you are too young to have been born, I think, even at the time, but those of you who are older remember how an entire language comes into being, both about the Middle East, but also about terrorism in this context. And the person who comes to personify this is Ayatollah Khomeini, the person who would take charge of the Iranian Revolution. So here is a Time magazine cover. There's a lot we can say about each of these images, and I look forward to your interpretations after I'm done. But the one thing we can see about this is, first of all, the photograph of Jimmy Carter is an actual photograph, whereas the representation of Khomeini is a sketch. And no matter what you may think of Khomeini, and I'm not particularly sympathetic to his views, that is a particularly demonic sketch, right? He looks evil. His eyes are jaundiced. They are yellow. Look at him. He looks positively fearsome, you know. And there you have it, the clash between the West and the barbaric, uncivilized East. Actually, they even go one step further. There's a halo effect on Jimmy Carter's head, right? He looks almost godlike while Khomeini looks demonic. And in Edward Said's book, this is another book, it's called Covering Islam, he talks about how Iranians were largely dehumanized in the way they were presented as irrational mobs, filled with this inexplicable hatred for the United States, and so on and so forth. That trope keeps coming back again and again. This is a piece that Bernard Lewis wrote called The Roots of Muslim Rage, where he first coined the term clash of civilizations. Again, here we have irrational rage. He uses that term, irrational rage. What do we have? We have a stock caricature of an Arab man, turbaned, bearded, and if you can't see his eyes, he's got red veins, which are actually symbolic of the American flag. So just rage, we can't explain this rage. This is irrational rage, and these are the roots of Muslim rage. And so what you see through this kind of work is the reflection, is the realization of a racial characteristic that is accorded to terrorists, right? Terrorists become brown, angry men whose anger is irrational and who are forced, because of a cultural conflict, to make war with the West. And in case you think this is an ideology that lived only in the 1980s, I brought the Newsweek cover from 2012 when there were protests that broke out all over the Middle East and South Asia. And you see there on the left, the typical bearded, turban, angry Muslim man, and the one next to him whose emotions are so big that they cannot be contained. You know, these are stock images that we now immediately identify with a whole set of motives. And apparently it's genetically, sort of stamped in the DNA. So even a young child is born with this sort of irrational hatred of the United States. And there are no social reasons for why people might be angry. So anyway, so we go through the 1980s. And in the political sphere, we see what's going on. And I explain how in the news sphere, these ideas get reproduced. What about the cultural sphere? What about Hollywood? I'm going to show you a clip from a video called Real Bad Arabs, where, we'll watch it and we'll talk about
it. The movies that we see basically follow Washington's policy. It's reflected in the cinema over and over again, particularly during the 1980s and the 90s, where you had perhaps 30 films which showed Palestinians as a people who were intent on injuring all Americans.
How may we help you, Jad?
One of the most despicable portrayals of Arabs and Palestinians occurs in the 1987 film Death Before Dishonor. First, they murder a guard, and then slaughter an Israeli family. They kidnap and torture an American Marine, and in cold blood execute another. And they burn the American flag right in front of the American embassy, and then dispatch a suicide bomber to blow it up. One reason we've not been allowed to empathize with any Palestinian on the silver screen is due to two Israeli producers, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. These two filmmakers created an American company called Canon, and they released in a period of 20 years at least 30 films which vilify all things Arab, particularly Palestinians. They even came out with a film called Hell Squad, showing Vegas showgirls trouncing Arabs in the middle of the desert. I think the most effective film they've ever done, one of the most popular and most racist, is The Delta Force. Here Palestinians hijack a plane and terrorize the passengers, especially the Jewish ones.
Pick out the passport with Jewish names.
There is no form of communication more powerful than film in creating propaganda, and Golan and Globus took it to another level.
Stop it! Stop it!
Certainly American producers play a role in vilifying Palestinians. I mean, perhaps the most anti-Palestinian film is True Lies.
This apparently is the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
Crimson Jihad will rain fire on one major U.S. city each week until our demands are met.
This film is shown on television almost every week, over and over again. It is part of our visual heritage.
Give me the key! Come on, child! You don't want to die, do you? Give me the key, and you won't get hurt. I give you my word.
No way, you wacko!
And we never see Palestinians who suffer under occupation, Palestinians in refugee camps, Palestinians who are victimized, who are killed, innocent Palestinians. These images are denied us. Now, why are they denied? Is there an unwritten code in Hollywood saying we cannot and will not humanize Palestinians? I mean, why can't we humanize Palestinians in the same manner in which we humanize Israelis? Is not the life of a Palestinian child, media-wise, Hollywood-wise, politically-wise, as important, as humane, as valuable as the life of an Israeli child? And if the answer to that is yes, why can't we see that on silver screens?
The 1980s and 1990s, as Jack Shaheen, Professor Jack Shaheen, he has studied over 1,000 films in the Hollywood pantheon to look at how Arabs and Muslims are represented, and I just showed you a small clip where he talks about this particular argument about the Israeli role in constructing the brown Palestinian terrorist. But suffice it to say that there are lots of films, including films produced, sponsored by the Department of Defense. There's a long history, by the way, of various security agencies, the and CIA, the FBI, Department of Defense, and so on, having offices in Hollywood and having informal relationships with Hollywood producers so that the stories that they want are the ones that actually get told in television shows, in films, and so on. But not all of Hollywood is like this. I do want to suggest that there are films that go against the grain. But suffice it to say, there are enough of these films so that through the 1980s and 90s, this association between terrorism and Arabs and Muslims becomes cemented. So much so, when the Oklahoma City bombing takes place in 1995, it was immediately decided, before any evidence was provided, that Arabs and Muslims are to blame. Of course, it was not, right? It was Timothy McVeigh, a homegrown terrorist, if you will. But terrorism experts at this point are all over the media trying to explain that this has uniquely Arab and Muslim characteristics, this bombing in Oklahoma. And one such person who's interviewed quite extensively is a man by the name of Stephen Emerson. He's a journalist I would say, in quotations. He produced a documentary called Jihad in America that was shown on PBS in 1994. Conspiracy theories put forward that there are secret cells all over waiting to explode. And he's actually part of this larger alliance that I refer to in my book as the new McCarthyites, who've actually played a very important role in shaping this racist language around terrorism. But 9/11, to come to the moment of 9/11, 9/11 then cements the associations between Arabs and Muslims and terrorism. And from then on, it's no longer necessary to keep producing this image of the brown terrorist again and again in popular culture, because it's not necessary, right? That horrific moment already seals that in our imagination. And in fact, the Bush administration wouldn't use this sort of blatant propaganda as the ad I showed you in the beginning. Instead, they would rely on the clash of civilizations argument. Bernard Lewis, the author of this notion, was actually invited to the White House after the events of 9/11 to be part of a team of people who would then come up with a response to 9/11. And it is from him and other people that the War on Terror brand actually comes into being. Now, the problem, of course, is the Bush administration overplays its hand. It has discredited the image of the United States around the world, and that's when Obama comes to power. And he comes to power with the mandate of rehabilitating the image of the US around the world. And so it's not a coincidence that one of the first things that he would do is to go to Egypt and make a speech where he denounces the clash of civilizations. He talks about the contributions that Muslims have made to human civilization and so on. And he reframes the war on terror using language and using tropes that are much more liberal in their orientation. And I talk about that some in the book, although Arun Kundanani, who's here, has an excellent piece called The Roots of Liberal Rage, twisting Bernard Lewis's original title, which does a really excellent job of the part played by liberals in reshaping and rebranding Islamophobia and the war on terror. What I want to do in the time that I have is focus on the If You See Something, Say Something campaign, which by now you've already all seen, right? And maybe you have something to say about, but I certainly have something to say about it. And I want to talk about how this See Something, Say Something campaign has inculcated a threat consciousness, so much so that that terrorism has now become normalized and routinized, and that's why you no longer need the image of the brown terrorist front and center. It's always in the background, if you will. And so this is also why, as I said earlier, the Norman Lear Center found that images in popular culture don't really rely on the brown terrorist anymore. So what's happened? Why has this shift actually occurred? Well, first of all, 9/11 sort of sears this association in our minds. And now the key argument that needs to be won is to win consent for the birth of a national security state, a massive national security state, which uses practices like extrajudicial killings, torture, surveillance, and so on and so forth. And so that becomes the focus of the cultural politics of this era. And so a show like 24, I don't know if people have seen that show 24, it's coming back again, This show has a whole bunch of bad guys. It's not just Arabs and Muslims. There are all sorts of races of people who are the bad guys. And that's fine because it relies on the fear generated by 9/11 to show that Agent Bauer, the hero, right, should be allowed to do whatever is necessary to, including torture, to actually stop the ticking bomb from going off. Have you seen the show 24? It's set against, a clock, and there's this constant pressure and this fear that if Agent Bauer does not find these bad guys, whatever race they may be, then we're all doomed. There's going to be another disaster. And so the emphasis shifts from particular kinds of bad guys to the means necessary to keep Americans safe, and therefore the need for a massive national security apparatus. And in some ways, the way that Agent Bauer behaves is sort of reflective of the Bush era ethos, right? It's a sort of cowboy, wanted dead or alive, I will do whatever I want, won't be held back by rules and laws sort of thing. But as I said earlier, this does not bode well, this does not work out very well for the Bush administration. And so Obama actually changes this rhetoric quite significantly. And I say rhetoric very purposefully because I don't think the policies have actually changed. I think we've seen a deepening and strengthening of the national security state, but the language certainly undergoes a change. And what we see is an emphasis on this notion of a post-racial society, right? The idea that racism is a thing of the past and the US is now more than ever a melting pot. It's a perfect multicultural society where peoples of various races, ethnicities, national origin all live together harmoniously. And of course, Obama in his person kind of exemplifies this, right? White mother, Kenyan father, and so forth. And so there is this emphasis, the idea of a post-racial society predates, the election of Obama, but it gets emphasized after the election of Obama. So that's one shift that's taking place. The other is the shift within the Obama administration from focusing on the terrorist enemy out there to focusing on the homegrown, domestic terrorists. And this shift actually takes place in 2009. In the book, I call this the moment of the green scare, because the news media coverage is around a number of incidents having to do with brown people in this country who are either citizens or permanent residents. And of course, the one anomaly in all of this is this woman called Jihad Jain, who is this white, petite, blonde, green-eyed woman, and there's a lot of hand-wringing about how could this woman possibly have done this, and of course, Islam is to blame. I did an analysis of all of this, but suffice it to say, in 2009, we see a shift inwards to domestic terrorism and the enemies within us, and these two shifts come together to animate the logic of the see something, say something campaign. So let me show you if you go to the Department of Homeland Security's website, this is the introductory video that you will see.
The United States of America is home to over 330 million people. We are a country known for freedom, justice, and opportunity. The American dream draws people from across the globe, bringing different cultures, traditions, and ideas to the fabric of our great nation. At the same time, there are individuals in the United States who seek to carry out acts of terrorism and violence against our communities and our country.
Hello. Listen, I don't know if this is anything, but what I just saw looked really suspicious.
Definitely out of the ordinary. I was in the parking garage underneath the Federal Building off 3rd and J Streets.
It's not easy to put all the pieces together, and we don't expect you to. That's the job of law enforcement and intelligence analysts. But Homeland Security is a shared effort and responsibility.
It's much longer, but I want to at least give you the first bit of it to give you a sense of how multiculturalism, post-racial society, and so on comes together with a focus on the domestic enemy. So let's just break it down quickly. And again, I welcome your comments after I'm done with my presentation. So first and foremost, there's a very self-conscious effort to emphasize that the US is a land of immigrants and that multiculturalism is a good thing. But then the narrator, the godlike voice of the white man, tells us that some people are up to no good and cue scary music. And the face that we see of the guy who is using the spray paint on the security camera is presumably a white man. Do you see it any other way? Yeah. But if you think about it for a second, it actually doesn't sit logically with what the narrator just said. Because he said there are people who come here for the American dream who have different cultures, traditions, and ideas. So in other words, some of those people who have come here with these different traditions and ideas and so on must logically be the ones who are spray painting. And certainly if it was a white person, there are white supremacist and patriot groups, but their ideas don't come from out there. Their ideas actually come from right here. So there's a sort of logical inconsistency here, but then there's a very self-conscious racial politics going on in this film. Not only is the bad guy a white man, but the hero of the scene is a black man. He's African American, and of course this has now become a standard cinematic tradition in Hollywood. Particularly if you want to have a horrible film about the Middle East, have a black hero. If you've seen Rules of Engagement, we have Samuel Jackson, and he's the one who orders the execution of men, women, and children in Yemen, but it's a black man doing it, so can't be racist. Or Kingdom, Jamie Foxx, black hero, and so on. So what we see really at work here is a very clever appropriation of the language of multiculturalism to create a threat consciousness that trains us in how to behave and that instructs us to follow a particular kind of ritualistic behavior. But ultimately, the real protagonist of the film is not the African American hero, but the national security state, right? Because the lovely music that we get to say that we don't expect you to solve it, we will solve it, and so on. The rest is actually about the national security state. This is an ad for the national security state. So now I want to turn to some of the posters and the signs and so on, and look at the kind of work that they do in cultivating a threat consciousness. Those of us who lived in New York City are now intimately familiar with this slogan. This is on subway, all over the subways. This program actually was developed by the Transit Authority, the New York Transit Authority, back in 2002. But in 2010, it becomes a DHS program. The Department of Homeland Security takes it over, and the previous video, as I said, is on the DHS website. So let's take a look at some of these ads that we've all seen at some point, I'm sure. So there we have an MTA ad of an empty subway car. There is nothing in this car. But then that's the whole point, isn't it? Be suspicious of anything, right? Be suspicious of everything and be suspicious of anything that you see. And quite frankly, an image like this would not have made sense to us prior to 9/11. It would not have been seen as common sense in an era prior to 9/11, and that's exactly the work that this is doing. It's constantly reminding us about 9/11. In that sense, it's a security ritual, and thereby cultivating a sense of fear, but also a kind of siege mentality that another disastrous event is right around the corner. Now, in addition to the siege mentality, it's also inculcating a sense of vigilance. See something, say something, always be aware, right? And a sense of vigilantism as well, right? That we all have a responsibility to do this. And by casting a suspicious eye on everything and by holding a responsibility to call a cop or an MTA employee, what's happening is that we are being recruited into the mission of surveillance. That is, if it is our civic duty to participate in surveillance, right, then surely we cannot object to the state actually doing so. And so here we have exactly that. All of us are agents of surveillance, and therefore we need not fear anymore that Big Brother is watching us. People know George Orwell's book, 1984, because we are the ones doing the watching, and the government just happens to be one institution among others that is doing the surveillance. And I have a quote here from a piece by Marjorie Cohen titled Beyond Orwell's Worst Nightmare, where she says, Orwell could never have imagined that the National Security Agency would amass metadata on billions of our phone calls and 200 million of our text messages every day. Orwell could not have foreseen that our government would read the content of our emails, file transfers, and live chats from the social media that we use. But to pry us away, of course, from any attachment that we have to privacy, away from our fears on surveillance, you know, it becomes normalized by saying that we all participate, and if we have nothing to hide, then, you know, we should not be. Service announcements where figures associated with the sporting world are talking to us about it. Here we are on vacation. I'm going to take another 5-10 minutes.
Travel is part of the American way of life.
When we're on vacation, we keep an eye out for anything that looks out of place.
Miss your bag. When we travel from city to city, we pay attention to our surroundings.
Everyone plays a role in keeping our community safe.
Whether you're traveling for business or pleasure, be aware of your surroundings. If you see something suspicious, say something to local authorities.
Right, so vacations, schools, this is LSU taking over this slogan, and of course now the thing that we are taught to be afraid of is not the brown terrorist, but luggage, bags left somewhere, backpacks. I had another video here, but I don't think I'll show it in the interest of time. And here we have one Asian woman calling, texting, and the new security ritual that we are asked to engage in today is we observe and we text, like we used to be asked to duck and cover. And I'm going to show you a little clip from Duck and Cover. But because this message is so ubiquitous and such a constant daily presence in our lives, we no longer think about it consciously anymore. And the end result is that not only do we give our consent to the existence and proliferation of security cameras, right? In the first ad I showed you, the African-American hero is actually dismayed that the security camera has been blacked out. We give our consent to this kind of surveillance, and we don't bat an eyelid when we see massive police presence everywhere, including at subway stations, and even a military presence, for instance, at Penn Station. Now, even a generation ago, this would have been unacceptable. It would have been seen as a step towards the kind of police state and totalitarianism that George Orwell warned us of in his book 1984. And in fact, I was talking to a colleague as I was putting this presentation together. He's a New Yorker, born and bred in his mid-50s. And he says, you know, when he, during the Franco era, he went to Madrid for a pleasure trip. And he went to a museum. And he says he saw this soldier outside the museum with this huge automatic rifle, and he said he was just so horrified at the need for security presence outside a museum, right? And of course today we see this in our society, military personnel in civil society, we don't bat an eyelid, precisely because it's become routinized in the ways that I've just discussed. And threat consciousness, of course, is what secures our consent for the national security state. But I want to come back here to the notion of the sociological imagination. I asked you to step outside of the rituals that we take for granted and view them critically. And I know that for some of you that might be difficult to do. So I brought an image from another era. It's always easy to look back at the past and laugh at the stupidity of some of the rituals. And so let's do that for a second and see if you can then use that in our analysis of
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association. Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time. Fire is a danger. It can burn whole buildings if someone is careless. But we are ready for fires. We have a fine fire department to put out the fire, and you have fire drills in your school so you know what to do. Automobiles can be dangerous too. They sometimes cause bad accidents, but we are ready. We have safety.
This was a ritual that people would enact in schools, your parents, grandparents, and so forth, where a siren would go off and they would duck underneath their desks in preparation for a nuclear bomb. Now, well, there may be some small safety that a desk can offer you, but not very much. And so the question is, what is the point of this ritual really? It's about creating an obedient and scared populace that gives its consent to a massive national security apparatus. And keep in mind that this was the birth of institutions like the NSA, the CIA, the DIA, the NRO, and so on. They were born during this time, and these sorts of rituals helped to win consent for the formation of these agencies. And in fact, it's normalized by saying it's just like the fire department, right? That we need to have these institutions as well. No time for Homeland, so I'm just going to come to a close with resistive. I said that shifts take place and therefore there's space for resistance. Excellent film called Paradise Now, which actually reframes who a terrorist is and why someone might take up a suicide mission. And here are some memes reframing to see something, say something. That's Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning. And here we have Edward Snowden. Right, so it's a very different something that we are being asked to report in these cases where this meme has been taken over and reframed. So, conclusion. Now, some of you are probably thinking, all right, so you've spoken about the massive national security state, and you're obviously against it, which I am, and for its dismantling. So what do we do about the threat of political violence, right? What do we do? Now, certainly, I don't want to see innocent people being killed or injured in any way. But my argument is that the level of response needs to correspond to the actual level of threat. And, I don't want to get into a definitional debate around what is terrorism and so on, but by any measure, the number of Americans who are killed yearly due to terrorism, however defined, is tiny. It's really, really small. You have a 1 in 20 million chance that you will die because of a terrorism-related incident. Your odds are much higher of dying from heart disease, car accidents, assault from a firearm, even walking. And this side we have storms. You're twice as likely to die from a bolt of lightning hitting you and killing you than you are from terrorism, right? And so this is really not a question about keeping Americans safe and protecting them from harm. The study that really bothered me when it came out was Harvard University did a study which show that 45,000 Americans die each year because they don't have access to adequate health care. And yet we are not putting the kind of resources that we put into the national security state in order to keep these Americans alive. And so my response, first and foremost, is that the response should be in proportion to the actual threat. Second, if you actually want to end political violence or terrorism, you've got to look at the roots of why it actually happened. You turn on the television right now and it's all about Sochi, right? It's about the Olympics and the security measures that are being taken by Russia. And few people are asking the question, some are, but in the margins of what have the Russians done, for instance, to the Chechens? How have they handled the grievances that the Chechens have brought against the Russian state? How have their political aspirations been treated by the Russian state? And why might some of them use violence at an event like the Olympics? What has the US done in the Middle East, in Afghanistan? What are its real interests in these regions? Why do some people take to political violence? I think it's only when we start asking those questions that we can actually put an end to this form of violence, this form of political violence. And of course, answering those questions will take me another 45 minutes, and so I'm not going to answer it except to point you to the politics of empire. And I'll just come to a close by saying that I hope that at least I've provided you a little bit of critical distance in terms of this, massive national security state. But if I haven't convinced you, I'm open to your disagreements, questions, and anything else you want to say. Thank you very much.